Hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you to the delegates for joining us this morning and for the various authors and reviewers who have contributed to this special issue. I would also like to pay thanks to Shelley Gray, who's done a considerable amount of work in reviewing papers and organising today's event. I think our agenda today, in terms of audience, we see the world of health and physical education as being central to educational aims. Therefore, we're delighted to be part of a special issue in the Curriculum Journal because we see that as a leading space in education for the discussion of ideas and also to be part of BERA in joining this virtual event today. There are 8 papers in the Curriculum Journal special issue, and 5 of them form part of the special issue today. There are another 3 papers which I recommend to you. Firstly, there's a paper by Ben Williams and Jessica Lee from Griffith University in Australia, which looks at conceptualizations of expertise. There's also a paper by Professor Joe Harris and a team of authors from Loughborough, which also looks at a principle-based approach to pedagogical strategies with regard to promoting physically active lifestyles. And lastly, there's a paper by Professor Paul Wright from Northern Illinois University in the United States, which looks about the capacity for understanding more how social and emotional learning might become embedded in physical education. I think in terms of the context for today's series of papers, that we do recognize that health and physical education is in a precarious position at the moment. It's full of challenges and changes inevitable. But having said that, we do think that viewing the educational landscape around us is slightly better if you adopt a glass half full approach rather than a glass half empty. So this is not an argument to maintain the status quo, but it is an argument to recognize that change is needed. And the more you can engage with change rather than just identify that change might be needed is a good step forward. So we think, as I say, communicating with this wider educational audience is an important step in that approach. When we introduced the paper for the special issue, we have underpinned it by some of the philosophical writings of John Dewey with regard to education. And Dewey, we think, even though he wrote relatively seldomly about the education of the body, when he did, he had some really rich and insightful things to say, not least to dismantle the dualism that the two physical growth is something separate to mental growth, because he argued that the two coincide in times, and that if you have reference for childhood, then the first specific rule is have to make sure that healthy bodily development takes place. So we see considerable potentialities in pursuing this line of thinking. Also, Dewey's pragmatism, we think, is a useful way forward here, because throughout a thread which takes place throughout Dewey's writing is this notion that it is how educators respond to challenge, conflict, and change that is vital for them if we're going to promote the things that we have a shared interest in, such as inventiveness, protection of rights, promoting active participation, and such like. So that's the approach, the glass half full approach we've tried to take forward. We do recognize that these ideas can become unstuck if the ideas taken announced are rather overly optimistic, or they're insufficiently situated, but or implausibly argued. I think there is a potential risk that theory and practice can fracture, and there's a lack of trust between these respective audiences. But we don't view that as being a concern in the 5 papers that are coming up just now. because we think they do not contain those risks, and they highlight in their own various ways the type of support, interventions and professional development that might help the field of health and physical education, and what might help things better. So I recommend these papers to you. I hope you enjoy the presentations. And of course, we welcome your questions so we can engage with them during our discussion time. Our first paper this morning is from Kirsten Petrie from the University of Waikato, who's joined us late into the evening to provide a presentation, and we're very welcome for that. The paper addresses some of the complex ideas around this notion of trying to embed the world of physical education into some societal thinking or about creating good conditions for the growth of young people. And so there are discussions here about alignment and deconstructing boundaries, which I think are very relevant. So I look forward to that presentation now. Thank you.
Tēnā tātou katoa, ka nui, ka hui mai nei ki tēnei ona kura, ki te whare wānanga o Waikato, ko Kirsten Petrie tuku ingoa. I'm Kirsten Petrie from the University of Waikato in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I opened in Te Reo Māori, which is the Indigenous language of New Zealand, and something we are really working hard to revitalise. So I will be careful in trying to use my Te Reo Māori words so I help you understand. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks for that welcome, Malcolm. I'm speaking today on behalf of my colleagues as well, Associate Professor Clive Pope and Dr. Darren Powell, who were part of this work with me. In this work, we, as Malcolm said, we're trying to explore some of the notions around enhancing wellbeing for young people, enhancing physical activity, physical education, and we were looking at how people who are charged with delivering professional learning grapple with the complex ideas and the terms and language that we use around physical activity. Oh, and now I don't seem to be able to, oh, yep, here we go. So I'm just going to go back. This was born out of a piece of research we did around what Sport New Zealand called Play.Sport, in itself a problematic name. Play.Sport was designed to enhance and improve the physical literacy of young people in New Zealand communities. It was part of a broader obesity plan by the government and funded in a cross-sectorial way. So education, health, ACC and Physical Education New Zealand were involved with Sport New Zealand. And physical literacy, the physical literacy approach was a new term for New Zealand at that time in terms of as a notion and an idea. What was delivered was a professional learning and development program delivered by facilitators who worked directly with school leadership teams, PE mentors who worked directly with teachers primarily, and activators who worked across the community space, all charged with embedding different aspects of what I'm going to term movement education, drawing on Peter Arnold's work, to enhance the physical literacy of young people. Our research, and you can obviously read more about this in the paper that's available, but was framed around collaborative practitioner action research. And as you can see, I hope you can see from the slides, we gathered data in a range of ways, both from our meetings, but also the workforce interactions of schools, the documentation they were using, and just their personal notes around the experiences. And we used a dialogic oral inquiry approach to draw on all the artifacts from those data and forming dialogic conversations around that to theme and analyse the work. Part of what became really apparent was there was a lot of complexity around what people understood by different terms, different meanings, and who was doing what. So I'm interested, and I think we're all interested in just getting a sense of what your thoughts are. So I've used the term movement education, doing the Slido, using Slido again. Interested to see what titles, names, phrases, words, whatever, best describes the focus of any movement education professional learning you have either received or been charged with delivering in the last 10 years. So what terms have you used? What's been the title of your presentations, your slides, your workshops that you've run? What fits under the umbrella of movement education in the worlds you work in? So I'm going to pause and give you a minute or two to log back into Slido and start listing some things. And in theory, they will appear. And I'll add one as a test. Given I've only got 10 minutes, I'm going to keep going, but it'd be good if people can keep adding. I see more words coming up, whether it's fundamental movement skills, sport, physical literacy, movement development, physical education, health and physical education. And here they're starting to flow in now. Physical development, experiential learning. I take it the bigger ones are also, as with any word cloud, are the ones that are most commonly used. And you can see that we get this explosion of terms. So for us, we were interested in how the professional development providers came to grips with understanding what they were charged with delivering and what it all meant. So please keep adding that to those, because it will give us a wealth of sense of what's going on internationally as we think about it. For us, and I don't know if you can see this very well, but the key phrases that came up were physical education, sport, play, physical literacy, and physical activity. Fundamental movement skills and teaching games for understanding also sat in there. What the challenge for the professional development providers was what do each of these things mean? Each of these has a complex theoretical, philosophical framing, means different things to different people. If you're working with teachers in schools, as we know, their own experiences around each of these things shape how they're thinking. For our professional learning providers, their own experiences also shaped how they understood it. Their undergraduate qualifications, so some had qualifications that lent themselves much more towards physical activity, while others had a physical education background. Very few had a good understanding of physical literacy, in line with Whitehead's theory, but that was what was being pushed by the Ministry of Education and Sport New Zealand. So for us, the challenge is, and the question I'm still left with is, what do each of these things mean? So, yep. Oh, here we go. So what does each mean to each person? How do they actually align? Is one an overarching term? Who's responsible for what? So when we're delivering in schools, who takes responsibility for delivering what areas, or do they intersect? Are they interchangeable? So when we work with teachers, when we work with professional learning providers, often in our experience and in the research, the terms we use interchangeably and sometimes meant completely different things, sometimes meant the same thing. And I guess we were left with that challenge of, what does this mean for the classroom teacher, the practitioner, the professional learning provider, the initial teacher educator? What message are we giving? And while each of these things, concepts, ideas, practices, subjects, however we want to define them, have meaning and are theoretically really sound, for the person on the ground, what does that mean and look like? So we're left with the challenge of, how do we deconstruct some of the boundaries that have been created between these things and get more siloed and bounded as more theory and research gets done, and some things get celebrated more than others and pushed forward, and maybe that's part of evolution. But how do we think about movement education and making it less complex for the end user. The classroom teacher, and particularly primary school teachers in my end, but equally early childhood, how do they make sense of it? And are we actually just creating confusion for them? Are we putting them into a position where they become paralysed by that information? How do we work with that glass half full approach to think about what's our common ground? Are these really different concepts? Are there similarities that we could live with? Where do we want to create divides and where do we want to join them? And how do we celebrate the differences that our different contexts and regions offer while not losing sight of some of the theoretical perspectives that really, have held these things like physical literacy and physical education in place for so long? So I guess my call to arms is, what actions do we take as a community to disentangle some of this complexity rather than building more silos and making it harder for the end user? And that's part of the challenge that I see us facing and going forward. We can keep dividing, but we won't make change if we go that way. So how can we work together more sophisticatedly? And that's what we're interested in doing. So ngā mihi nui, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. And I think now it's time for questions. I went fast.
Thanks, Kirsten. That was really interesting. And I do recommend that you read the paper. There's obviously a lot more in the paper that I think you'll find really interesting. At the moment, we have no questions, but that's okay. Please don't forget at any point during the session today to ask questions. And if you think of questions later on to ask Kirsten, then pop them in the question function and we'll be able to bring them back at the end of today's session. But I guess one of the things I would like to ask is really, you've mentioned one of the challenges is, what are the implications for teachers? I mean, what types, do you have any kind of conception of what issues this does cause for teachers in the classroom?
So for the teachers that were part of the study and other teachers, particularly in primary schools that I've worked with, there is a paralysis because they don't know what they're doing when. So at one point we're pushing a fundamental movement skills approach, then physical literacy comes in, and in our context we've got health and physical education as a curriculum area, and different priorities get pushed at different times depending on who's leading what. And so there is a sense of, I'll just keep doing what I'm doing because it'll change again tomorrow. And I don't think that helps us move forward. And our professional learning providers were equally struck by the same challenge.
Yeah, and you mentioned at the end there, what can we as a community do to sort of start to disentangle and deal with these concepts? Being someone who works in ITE or PEAT or in higher education, what can we do? So how can we help our students when they go out into the field to start to grapple with some of these ideas?
Yeah, the continual challenge and exciting at the same time. Language becomes really important from our end because the words we use shape their understandings, and I think we get beholden to those things. So, I would hate ever for there not to be physical education, but from the practitioners we've worked with in this project and other ones, we just got rid of that as a term in their classrooms and talked about what learning is most important and how does that look. And in doing so, it helped us support our students and initial teacher ed to think about, you're just planning for learning, not for the activities. And by taking that shift and not thinking about what the subject name was, it actually was just like, let's put the learner back at the centre. Let's not get beholden by different theoretical perspectives. Not that we don't want them to understand those concepts, but let's not be beholden by that. Let's think about who our learner is. And I guess that's where we've tried to go.
Great. So needs of the learner first, that kind of bottom-up approach.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll pause for another moment to see if any questions come in, whether or not there are any of our other speakers have any questions. But if there are no questions, we can move on perhaps to our next speaker. So I'll pause just for a moment. Okay, well, we'll just move on. So the next presentation is entitled Health-Oriented Bildung, or An Obligation to a Healthy Lifestyle, a critical analysis of current PE curricula in Germany. And the presentation today is by Sebastian Ruhn of the University of Graz, and he co-authored this paper with Günther Stibbe from the German Sports University. And in this paper, the authors present the findings from their content analysis of PE curricula in Germany, and offer insights into how health and PE curricula are conceptualized in 3 out of the 16 federal states. So I'll now hand over to you, Sebastian.
First of all, I want to thank for the invitation and the opportunity to talk here to you. And I'm also talking on behalf of Günther Stibbe. This is work of 2, as Shirley said. And first of all, I want you to let us know what you think. What should, in your eyes, be the main goal or the main goals of health education in schools? And we will look at this at the end of the presentation. So I just want you to write your opinion in the link. So, but where's the link? I'm sorry, you see it, I think. I don't see it. So just give your opinion and we'll have a look at this later on. So before I go into detail, I'd like to draw comment on the special situation in Germany, especially on 2 characteristics. So first of all, we don't have health physical education as a subject, but physical education. And in here, we have health education, health promotion as pedagogical perspectives. So this is the first thing. And the second is that we have the idea of Bildung as an important concept in our German tradition, and it's still of importance today. So not surprisingly, also on the conceptual level, physical education is oriented towards Bildung in the German-speaking world, at least in the mainstream. But what does Bildung mean? First of all, we distinguish Bildung from education. So we have Bildung and education, and we understand them as closely complementary. While in our understanding, education processes commonly convey values, attitudes, knowledge, and skills, Bildung is aimed at the active and voluntary act of forming oneself. Or as Dörpinghaus said, the quote is here on the slide, the concept of Bildung means development of a person's maturity and their ability for self-determination and self-development. This is not least important to protect themselves from social appropriation and blind adaptation in an emancipatory way. So it's about being critical and not taking over values, norms, knowledge without critical reflection. Sorry. This means that health-oriented Bildung is more than health promotion and preparing for an active or healthy lifestyle. It means that also understanding what and how a healthy lifestyle could be should be critically reflected, and the role young people wanted to play in their lives in an emancipatory manner. So it's about balancing objective perspectives on Bildung and health and subjective perspectives. But on the level of curricula, since 15 years, there's a transition towards standardized, competence-oriented curricula in the German-speaking world with fixed learning outcomes for students. So against this background, the main question of this study is how does this infect the idea of Bildung in the curricula concerning health issues? Therefore, we examined and discussed similarities and differences between the current curricula in various federal states in Germany. And this is done from a critical perspective. So what exactly did we do? We conducted an analysis of current PE curricula requirements at lower secondary school level, and we took gymnasiums, since gymnasiums are the only school form that exists in every federal state. As Shirley mentioned already, in Germany we have 16 federal states, and every state has its own school system and its own curriculum. So we took 3 exemplary federal states, North Rhine-Westphalia, Baden-Württemberg, and Saxony-Anhalt. North Rhine-Westphalia is a state which is innovative in curricular development, and Baden-Württemberg is a state which is traditionally conservative. Saxony-Anhalt is one of the states that were part of East Germany before 1990. So we have 3 different traditions in here. The 3 core curricula are competence-oriented, oriented and consists mainly of standardized learning outcomes. It's like 80–90% of the text are standardized learning outcomes, and only the rest is about educational goals. Only in North Rhine-Westphalia we have a framework additionally, so there's more space for educational goals. We conducted a hermeneutically oriented qualitative text analysis using these categories you can see on the slide. These categories mainly diversify objectifying perspectives on health education and subjectifying perspectives. Let's have a look at the results. Between the states, there are clear similarities. In the curricula, the narrative of sporting activity as a medication for diseases of civilization is prominent at the target level. It's about being physically active to counteract deficits in movement caused by civilization, or slightly different in North Rhine-Westphalia. We see exercise, games, and sport are important resources for stabilizing health, which can contribute to improving physical performance, well-being, and psychophysical resilience. So, physical education should initiate an improvement of pupils' physical fitness in the sense of preventive training. This is what we see here. In this context, reference is made several times to scientifically proven principles and an objectifying understanding. And an objectifying understanding of health, the curricula of all three federal states unmistakably convey the imperative of taking responsibility for one's own body and health. The focus is obviously on maintaining or increasing individual physical fitness and performance. So you can see on the slide here, pupils must above all increasingly take over responsibility for their own physical fitness and reflect on interactions with mental fitness, health, and quality of life. Or there's also talk of responsible handling of your own body. In the health-related learning outcomes, which are the main part of the documents, there's an overall tendency in narrowing health towards optimizing performance and preventing injuries. A subjective perspective appears as a double-edged sword. Individual experiences are of importance in the documents, yes. Like here you see in the first quote, being able to assess one's own body and one's own resilience is important for the development of the image of the body and self. But in the next sentence, you can see here, next sentence in this document, there's a clear focus on the improvement of physical performance and psychophysical resilience as fundamental aims. So pupils should, through their own experiences, develop the awareness of the importance of regular exercise through subjective well-being and healthy way of life. So it looks as if individual experiences are instrumentalized. Also in other documents, we can see this. A somehow seriously subjectivizing understanding of health only appears in the framework for physical education in North Rhine-Westphalia. A less controlling and more appreciative, differentiated perception of one's own body, its possibilities and limits of action and their changeability moves into the focus. However, all that remains of this on the core curricula of North Rhine-Westphalia is backwording at the target level. In the core curriculum then, we see subjectifying and the associated tendency to body experiences are used for testing the improvement of general physical conditions. So what does this mean? Overall, it seems to be clear that health promotion in the examined documents appears to be understood primarily in the sense of shaping adolescents in a certain way. They have to be physical active to prevent from diseases of civilization, to be physical active to enhance physical and psychological performance. They have to be responsible for health. This all is based on a firmly defined, objectifying understanding of health and natural scientific knowledge on health and health promotion. It seems that all this has to be done in the interest of society. To put it in a nutshell, I'd say, in the end, fitness and health standards count, not subjectivity. Not only does this seem to leave little room for reasonable self-determination, but it seems that even emancipation from external determination, for example, from health imperative, brought to the pupils is ultimately not desired. Rather, it shows an unmistakable orientation towards a natural scientific conception of health, which seems to leave little scope for other subjective perspectives. Accordingly, from the perspective of critical pedagogy, it could be stated that it would be basically made impossible to open up possibilities and alternatives. And if we now step out of the German context, what are your expectations? I wanted to have a look at these. Okay, confident. Well, I have to move this away to see it better. So, confident children develop physical literacy, meaningful experiences, meaningful health, lifelong. It's interesting, yeah. So I think we could meet the idea of Bildung, maybe something that could fit very well together with your ideas, if I have a short look in here, but I think we can discuss this now in the discussion. So my question would be, do you face similar challenges as we do in Germany, and maybe what can be done? So we have time for discussion now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sebastian. Again, really interesting. You've asked a nice question at the end, and we have some questions now that the audience are asking here. So let me just... So Jonathan McKeever, I think this is directed to you. So this seems to emphasize the cognitive domain. Where do you see future directions which emphasize the affect? So I think that's related to you. And perhaps I could just comment as well, at the end of the presentation there, you said, is this your own experience? I've been involved in a bit of a discourse analysis of some curricula in the UK, so Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And certainly it's in relation to discourses of health, public health seems to be very dominant. So my experience is quite similar to yours. Although discourses of performance tend to dominate overall within physical education. But yeah, Jonathan makes a comment about the cognitive domain, so understanding personal responsibility. So he's asking, in your context, where do you see future directions which emphasize affect?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in the idea of Bildung, traditionally, it's quite cognitive oriented. So I agree in the question, and it's a critical point. But if we look at movement and sport education, so we're focusing quite on experience, as also Dewey did, for instance. And if we take the moment of experience, I think we can understand that the division between cognitive and bodily moments in experiencing something, they're quite mixed. So the division is not a quite fixed division. And in my eyes, the effect are important in experiencing moments in physical education. And then the reflection on these experiences are also reflections on all. It's not just a reflection on cognitive aspects, it's a reflection on everything. So this would be my answer here.
Okay, excellent. I guess I have another question actually. So I don't know a lot about physical education in Germany. So the way in which health is conceptualized in these documents, is that reflected, are you able to say, is that reflected in the practices of teachers? So what does physical education look like in Germany? Mm-hmm. Are you able to comment on that?
Yeah, of course I am. In Germany, I think we have a quite tradition since the 1970s. We're quite sport oriented. We have been, so teachers really are oriented towards doing sport in physical education. Our subject is also called sport. I don't know if you know this. It's not physical education. We have the name sport for it. So we have a quite sport-oriented tradition in doing sports in several different areas, like doing different areas of sport activities. But it's not so much about educating physicality. It's about educating doing sports. And I think we're also challenging this tradition, because then the health promotion is something coming in, and for the traditionalists, health promotion is something challenging to the sport education, if you understand what I mean. So there's a conflict here. And now if we come with the idea of building, this is the third one coming in. So it's quite complex situation. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, I've got lots of questions that I could follow on, but we've now got a question from Antonio Calderon. Thanks, Antonio. And he says, from your perspective, what should be the strongest argument or evidence to convince policymakers that a salutogenic or a Bildung orientation might be the approach to follow in PE, so against the biomedical orientation?
Mm-hmm. The strongest argument in my eyes would be that Bildung is something, as I said before, if we focus on experience, I think Bildung is something that is important for the whole person. And the whole person should be builded. I don't know how to say that. Yeah, it's just an invention of the word now. And and if we talk about the whole person, there should be also Bildung in movement, physical education, towards health education, and all this. And I think this is quite important for educating the whole person in a quite deeper sense. So this will be my main argument.
Okay. So again, I'll pause for a moment to see if we have any other questions. But I think that's us as far as questions go. So thank you very much, Sebastian. And Sebastian will be here at the end of the presentations to take part in our panel discussion. So again, if you've got any questions for him, then you can use the question function and we will keep those for later. But I'll now introduce our third presentation. So our third presentation is entitled Personal Visions of Physical Education Student Teachers, Putting the Education at the Heart of Physical Education. And this is by my colleagues from Edinburgh, Mike Jess, who will be presenting today, but this was co-authored with Paul Macmillan, Nicola Karst, and Karen Monroe, all again from the University of Edinburgh. So in this paper, the authors present the view that the curriculum voice of the physical education profession, and particularly the voice of physical education teachers, will be an important catalyst for the global repositioning of physical education as a more central feature of school curricula. So Mike, I'll just pass over to you now.
Thanks very much, Shirley. Right, so why personal vision? So first point, briefly, PE is not a static subject, it's constantly becoming, and I'm already seeing today the different disciplinary approaches, curriculum approaches that are starting to really drive the way that physical education is starting to look, particularly in an educational context. But what we've also got are neoliberal governments outsourcing physical education. So we've now got many, many new stakeholders being added to that whole agenda about looking at this becoming subject. So first, PE is very much on the development. Secondly, PE teachers, therefore, are always becoming, because we need to keep up to date and develop as professionals, and certainly not as technicians in this day and age. So how do teachers integrate ideas from these different disciplines and approaches to develop a coherent vision of how they view and practice physical education? So therefore, student teachers and teachers' personal visions, as Shirley just said, are an absolutely critical part of teachers' professional development over time, but also, we would argue, the subject development over time. So what are we talking about in terms of personal vision? So we've used Hammernes's quote here as the sort of starting point. Vision consists of images of what teachers hope could be or might be in their classrooms, their schools, their community, and in some cases, even society. Vision can provide a sense of reach that inspires and motivates them, the teachers, and invites them to reflect upon their work. So it's about a picture of what might happen in classrooms, how to negotiate and extend policy aspirations, and it's at the heart of developing that interplay, that sort of ecological interplay that I'll talk about later, between themselves, the departments they work in, the schools, and the policy context in which they're working. And a number of people are suggesting that perhaps teachers' vision over time becomes a key part of combating the restrictive nature of some of the neoliberal government ideas. And Hammerus also makes the point that if you don't know where you're going, any path will do. So does that mean that teachers just basically take other people's visions? So I think that the idea of vision is becoming, or should be, an absolutely fundamental part of how teachers and all people involved in PE look at this in the future. So this project is part of a longitudinal, a longer term project that starts with our MA students in PE. That's our undergraduate students in Edinburgh. They come for 4 years, and there is about 100, 110 students per year. Importantly, the students study a multidisciplinary approach: curriculum and pedagogy, sport and exercise science, physical culture, educational studies, and they also do work in schools. And this course that we're talking about here, so this course, this project starts in the year 4 course that integrates all the work that they have done over the 4 years of their program. And what we did was we sent them an essay that looked at their personal visions for PE, the experiences that had most influenced that vision, and I won't talk about today, but also how strategically they would look at a professional development plan in the future. And we took data from 20 of the essays, which was about 25% of that final year group, and we used that data as the basis for our discussion. We supported that with some team debate and some poster presentations as the program or the course unfolded. We purposely selected for analysis around the breadth that the students had given us, that the internal coherence, and also the clarity. So in retrospect, we maybe could have been a bit broader, but we certainly looked for those that were quite coherent. And we went through a 5-step analysis. We originally, given all of our interest in complexity, we thought of using that, but we ended up looking at the ecological task, individual and environmental influences on their visions. And perhaps not surprisingly, and I'll very briefly do this, the ecological influences, the histories of the students, individually, their pre-university experiences were very important, be that from parents, family, teachers, coaches, etc. Environmentally, what was interesting, yes, school placement, university, but quite a lot of them talked about the influence of policy, very, very conscious of that. And we were conscious that an essay is a sort of limited form, but it was a starting point for all the students and it made them think about it. And we were quite pleased with the coherent and adaptive nature of how they presented their visions. But I think the key point that I want to really hammer home here is that the students' visions were educational, they were similar, but they were different. And if we look at the overarching educational visions that they presented, 12 of them looked at the idea of lifelong engagement, 5 on holistic learning experiences, 2 on inclusion, and 1 on adaptive practice. So all pretty educational, and a large percentage of them looking down the road at lifelong engagement. But the next 2 slides, I think, were very important in how these students were envisioning PE, because the subcomponents were all educational, but they were very different. Personalization, critical thinking, relationships, well-being, meaningfulness, learning environments. And what was really interesting on all these essays, that none of the components that the students brought to the table as part of their visions were actually the same. They were all different. And actually, even if we looked at things like meaningfulness, the students quite often represented these quite differently. So as they started to bring together these educational ideas to inform their vision, it was quite clear similarities, but differences. And we were a bit surprised that there was a sort of theoretical underpinning that informed virtually all of the essays that we looked at. Okay, I suspect the essay was an important part of that, and it was a final year course, but Salutogenesis came in, complexity, physical literacy, self-determination theory. So it was quite clear that not only were these visions educational, but actually, certainly at this point in their careers, they were educationally informed given the multidisciplinary nature of the program. So therefore, in conclusion, I think the importance of teachers' personal vision is not only an important part for them, but I think it's a really important part for the profession in the 21st century, given the becoming nature of PE, given the becoming nature of physical education teacher. This is early phase, and we will be tracking these students as we go through, but there were key similarities, but there were key differences. They were educationally focused and theoretically informed. And as we would expect, there were many, their ecological histories highlighted this difference from the very beginning. And it sets the foundation for tracking them later. Next steps, begin to track the students as they go into teaching. We actually have 55 students who have agreed to be tracked, and that's going to be an interesting part there. We're continuing to develop PCP4, the course, along this vision line, but interestingly, we've introduced the idea of personal vision to the first year of the program, and the paper was accepted, what, about a year ago, but we've actually started to include that as part of the first year program, and that has been really, really interesting. Another part will be looking at extending the data collection process as we go through. But teacher vision, I think, is something that we really need to be thinking about how that may be a key part for the future of physical education in the 21st century. Thank you, everybody. Finished. 10 minutes. Bang. Shirley.
Thanks, Mike. That was really interesting. Hopefully we'll get some questions up soon, but just whilst we're waiting to see if we have any questions, what do you expect to see or learn when they move into teaching and you track those students? I mean, sorry, you go.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because we've started to talk to colleagues in England and in Canada, and Tim Fletcher out in Canada did his PhD with Claire Kosnick, who looked at this issue. And the answer would be Kosnick's work suggests, and I would go with this, that in their first year of teaching, I think this will go out the window. But I think by the time they get to maybe the third year of teaching, if we start to revisit and the students have become in their own head teachers, I think they will start to look back to some of these ideas. So it's part of that on-term recursive process. And I'm not expecting it to be at the forefront of the students' heads at the moment, as in the early part of their teaching careers, particularly in COVID times. But I think in a couple of years, we might start to see some really interesting data emerging from this.
And will you keep in touch with them? Will you keep reminding them? Will you be part of the research process in terms of a stimulus to get them to continue to think? I mean, I guess there will be some departments where that kind of thinking flourishes. You know, you talked about the individual, the environment, so.
Yeah, so I think there's going to be some really even interesting stories that highlight how vision goes out the window. And I think even that in itself. So I think, and I'm also interested in the idea of if we start at the beginning of the journey in first, how important does their vision become by the time they leave? And it just strikes me, the more we do this, it just seems to be one of those obvious things that students and teachers to some extent are expected to do, but we've not actually focused on it. And it seems to be a key part that maybe is just assumed, but actually doesn't necessarily happen.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And there's some questions coming in now, Mike. So Anne McPhail, hi Anne, thanks for that. Are there any takeaway messages for the programme these students are on with respect to the reported preferences?
It's a good question. I think we need to start to, analyze that data, and how would that start to perhaps, what's the word, manipulate some of the courses that we do? So I think that's a good question. It's one that I hadn't really thought of, but the fact that we've gone back to first year, I think it allows us to start to, I mean, one of the things that we did was we got the fourth years this year on Zoom to explain their visions to the first years. And that was one of the most successful things. So the first years just arrived and started to get an idea of where the fourth years were coming from. So I think where we're going with this, I think it's questions like that that will start to come into the equation, and how will it get us to keep it broad while also focusing it.
And we have another question here from Jordan Wintle. So there's two questions here, but they're related. So there's something about, are you expecting to see a washout effect? But in adding to that, how do we build resilience in early careers teachers to challenge the status quo?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that, do we have to get them to challenge the status quo? I think it's about negotiating the status quo. So I think that the language is important. And I think that the washout bit, I mean, it will not completely wash out, but what will happen is that it's like anything, if we don't revisit it, if we don't go through that recursive process, it becomes almost by definition potluck if students continue with that. So going back to the question that Shirley asked, are we going to track this through? I think it becomes a really important part of this project, but perhaps for teacher education to actually keep in touch with as many teachers as we can, and therefore keep that narrative unfolding over time. And just go back to I'm not sure that it's all about challenging what's out there. I think we need to negotiate things. And I think that those skills, these strategic skills, I think are really, really important as part of the developing teacher.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. That's really interesting. So we have no other questions just now. So I'll thank you again for that and good luck with it all.
Thank you.
And we'll move on to our next presentation, I think, which is entitled Teacher Agency in Enacting Physical Education in a Period of Curriculum Change and Reform in Ireland. And the presenter today is Dylan Scanlon, and he co-authored his paper with Antonio Calderon and Anne McPhail, all from the University of Limerick. And in this presentation, the authors draw from the concept of agency and teacher agency, as well as figurational sociology, to explore the extent to which agency plays a role in one teacher's experience of enacting a new school subject, which was the Leaving Certificate of Physical Education. So Dylan, I'll pass over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Shirley. So first, we aim to explore the extent to which teacher agency plays a role in one teacher's enactment of physical education curriculum in Irish post-primary schools. Second, we aim to understand the influence of the teacher's network of relationships in his pursuit of the achievement of agency. Leaving Certificate Physical Education, or Leaving Cert PE, acted as the case study, the curriculum case study for the study. Leaving Cert PE is an examinable physical education subject which students optionally complete in the final 2 years of post-primary schooling, typically aged around 16 to 18 years old. So it's similar to senior cycle physical education in Australia or A-level physical education in England. Leaving Cert PE is a learning outcomes-based curriculum with 128 learning outcomes to be taught over the 2 years. The specification allows for a level of freedom in how these learning outcomes can be enacted, as it lists the outcomes with minimal direction in how they should be taught, allowing the teacher to design their own learning experiences for the learning outcomes. We wanted to delve deeper into this, exploring the translation process from learning outcome to learning experience. So we turn to the concept of agency. We're informed by Biesta and Tedder's conceptualization of agency, and they state here that this concept of agency highlights that actors always act by a means of their environment rather than simply in their environment, so that the achievement of agency will always result from the interplay of individual efforts, available resources, and contextual and structural factors. Mark Priestley and colleagues have developed this conceptualization of the achievement of agency as they explored elements which produce the achievement of teacher agency. While working with Priestley and colleagues' model of teacher and agency, we suggest figurational sociology provides an alternative viewing of the achievement of agency. We use the concept of a figuration to locate the teacher in his web or network of interdependent relationships. And we use this concept to understand the influence of these interdependent relationships on the achievement of agency. For this study, one teacher named Brendan was purposely sampled and interviewed weekly for his first year of teaching Leaving Cert PE, which resulted in 19 interviews, which gave an in-depth understanding of the teaching situation in which Brendan was in and a part of. The results were presented in 3 teaching episodes, and we will share one teaching episode here. This teaching episode occurred in a classroom where Brendan was enacting pedagogical approaches to accommodate students' interests. In this episode, Brendan had his students working in pairs in researching and discussing a particular element of a learning outcome around promoting physical activity. Straight away, Brendan observed that his students were not motivated in the task. He put it down to how he used his particular group work pedagogy in his last 2 classes. Brendan reverted to giving them the information they needed rather than letting them research it themselves. He immediately tried another pedagogical approach, similar to a World Cafe approach, whereby the students worked on one task at one table before moving to another table and to another and so on. But Brendan found the students lost engagement as they were not on task. To counteract this, Brendan tried to enact a jigsaw puzzle approach, whereby the students would continue to work in groups and then share their work with peers to build new knowledge and solve problems together. Again, this did not seem to work despite Brendan's best efforts to get them on task. Finally, Brendan opted to have a group discussion and debate, which they did engage in. But Brendan admitted it was him who did most of the talking, and he got them engaged by getting them to write into their workbooks. In this teaching episode, Brendan attempted 3 times in the space of 1 class to enact different types of student-centered pedagogies. And although his ability to make pedagogical decisions on the spot may be seen as an achievement of agency, how he ended up teaching the class was not how he would have ideally liked to. Examining this teaching episode through a figurational lens, we can begin to understand Brendan's actions in relation to his figuration, his network of interdependent people and relationships. In this episode, a strong relationship existed between Brendan and his students, and we can see how the unbalanced power relations played out in this scenario. Power, in figurational terms, is a core component of a figuration. It is a structural characteristic of all human relationships, which is consistently in flux. As such, power is not something one holds, but something that one has the ability to put people in powerful positions. Given Brendan's role as a teacher, it may be assumed that he possessed all the power in the classroom. But once Brendan exercised his position of power by telling the students what to do, the location of power moved to the students as they did not want to engage within his instructions. This unbalanced and constantly moving power ratio was repeated throughout the teaching episode and constrained Brendan's process of achieving agency. The power struggles in this teaching episode resulted in Brendan reversing from his agentic decision, that being the enactment of student-centered pedagogies, to a more traditional teacher-led approach, an approach he did not want to enact. This emphasizes the complexity of achieving agency and how it fluctuates throughout the process of teaching, even in one class. Throughout the data analysis, we kept coming back to this question: what does the achievement of agency look like? And further, if Brendan ever actually achieved agency? We found instead that Brendan continually operated within the process of achieving agency. By engaging in verbing nouns, we suggest the focus needs to be redirected from the achievement of agency to the achieving of agency. Once we focus on the achieving of agency, the process, we then gain a deeper understanding of the extent to which the teacher as one person has on the process. The teacher is only one element in a very complex teaching situation and equally complex figuration. We constructed a figure to visualize a figuration and the influential interdependent relationships a teacher has in their teaching situation when operating in the process of achieving agency. For example, we can see here the teacher in the center. and our interdependent relationships with groups of people that could be further broken down into further hexagons. And all these groups of people are interconnected and interdependent. And there are strong and weak interdependent relationships, for example, with students, other teachers, professional development providers, school management, parents, and curriculum makers, and the Department of Education and Skills, and that is just to name a few. We can gain a snapshot of the complexity of the teaching situation and how these interdependent relationships influence, enable, or constrain the process of achieving agency. By redirecting the focus from the achievement to the achieving of agency and locating the teacher in this complex web of interdependent relationships, we come to an understanding that it is impossible to link the achievement of agency with one element, including the teacher. We conclude that two limitations to understanding the teacher's achievement of agency would be: one, to believe the teacher has control of achieving agency, and two, that there is a desirable standard of teacher agency that can be achieved. With this in mind, I ask, what can we as a physical education community do in supporting teachers in the process of achieving agency? I'm going to focus on one consideration here and how best to support teachers in the process of achieving agency. We strongly suggest the need to move away from discourse that positions a huge amount of belief on the agency of a teacher. This study showed the minimal role a teacher appears to have in the process of achieving agency. We strongly advocate for the physical education community, that being teachers, students, teacher educators, professional development providers, and policymakers, to work together to enable collaborative thinking, discussion, and action. In communities of learners, these stakeholders can work towards a collaborative partnership and allow for collaborative discourse in sharing ideas of how to work towards achieving agency and supporting one another in the process. Such collaborative approaches could enlighten us on numerous aspects of teacher agency. For example, it could educate policymakers on the realities, not the ideals, of the role of the teacher in the process of achieving agency. And it could inform teacher education on how best to prepare pre-service teachers for this role. This may sound somewhat idealistic or romanticized, but it can be a reality. And we argue that this reality is the only way forward in supporting teachers in the process of achieving agency. I finish here on a quote from MacPhail in relation to redesigning physical education provision. We need to stop working in isolation and work with and learn from each other. Thank you.
Thanks. Well done, Dylan, and congratulations on submitting your PhD recently.
Thanks, Riley.
To let us know how you get on with that. So we have no questions at the moment. So people in the audience, if you have some questions, then please post them in the chat function. I guess a couple of questions I'll have just to get things going is, is the problem, I think you've alluded to it, the term agency. Do we actually mean something else when we mean agency? Is there, is it even possible to achieve agency? So, you've answered some of that question in your presentation, but to me, it seemed that the terminology here is the issue, or one of the issues.
Yeah, and that's reported. I know Mark Breesley and colleagues have talked about this, that the term agency is conceptualized in so many different ways in the literature. So we've gone with the achievement of agency, but as we've argued, it's nearly impossible to achieve agency. We're always working in the process of achieving agency, and we fluctuate in that process. There's different contextual, structural factors, the environment, and what we argue are interdependent relationships, which will either influence that process, enable it, and a lot of time constrain it. But the fluctuation of achieving agency, but I don't think we can. Agency is not a goal; it's a process.
Yeah, and for me, and I don't know the answer to this, but it just seems that we stop using the word agency and find another way to describe it.
Yeah, and there's different, like if you look at different curricula internationally, you have change agents or agency, and it's all built in. I think what it does, it puts a lot of unwanted and unnecessary pressure on the teacher that a lot of time, as we argue, they don't have control over. It's different relationships. So that's why we came to that conclusion of working together to help the process. And we think that's the way forward.
Great. Well, hopefully you'll have some influence moving forward as well. We do have a question now from Menno. Thanks, Menno. Hi Dylan, what are the implications from your findings for the Irish PEAT curriculum regarding the challenges for teachers around LCPE? Do pre-service PE teachers need to be prepared differently?
Thanks, Mano. Yeah, we spoke about how we need to prepare pre-service teachers to engage with curriculum and how to be like be critical of curriculum, how to become curriculum makers. Again, we emphasize that this shouldn't be done on their own. We should work with pre-service teachers, and we should bring practicing teachers. We tried this semester where we brought Leaving Cert PE teachers in to talk to pre-service teachers, so we can start to learn from each other. And I know when I went to the curriculum development in Scotland webinar recently, that's what Scotland were doing as well, getting teachers and pre-service teachers to talk to each other. So again, it's building those connections and working with each other to come to the goal. But yes, I think we have teacher education has a role to prepare teachers for that role of engaging with that process of achieving agency.
There are no other questions at the moment, but if it's okay with you, I have another question. So the Leaving Certificate for PE in Ireland, that's a very new curriculum development. Were there any support mechanisms put in place for teachers as they began the process of learning about how to understand and enact this curriculum? And did those support mechanisms recognise the complexity of that type of learning and the collaborative nature of that type of learning?
Yeah, so there was an extensive professional development programme in place where there was national workshops. There were 64 teachers who did the Leaving Cert PE in the first phase. And so there's national workshops where they all came together. And then there was formalised clusters, so community of learners based on geographical location where 6 to 9 teachers would work together. We've done another study on that about how those worked. And whilst they were successful in terms of community of learners and getting teachers to talk to each other, share ideas, what we were suggesting, and coming back to this paper, is those community learners could be open to different stakeholders. So teacher educators could go into those community of learners, policymakers, and we could learn from each other and have different perspectives. And in UL, we had a night where we called it a Critical Friends Evening, where we had Leaving Cert PE teachers come into teacher educators, and we worked together through learning outcomes, creating learning experiences for those learning outcomes, where the teacher educators had more maybe of a higher level of knowledge around pedagogical or theoretical concepts, but the teachers had that reality of enactment. So it was a really nice evening where we worked together to create resources for the Leaving Cert PE curriculum. So again, it comes back to the point that when we work together in these community learners, that can spread across the teacher education continuum, teacher education, practicing teachers, pre-service teachers, I think the ideas start to roll out, and the possibilities and potentialities of that are just amazing.
Yeah, and that sounds similar to the things that I'm aware of that are taking place in Wales at the moment with their new curriculum. But the interesting point, I guess, is many of these teachers will be doing this in their own time. This is not necessarily something that they are officially supported with to do.
Yeah, and you have to remember they have their second subject as well, and core PE and extracurricular. Yeah. So again, they're very, very busy people.
Challenging.
Yeah.
We have another question here from Laura Affrey. Thank you, Laura. Great work, Dylan. Linking back to previous points and your work here, can you say anything about the relationship between teacher agency and the likelihood of PE curriculum and pedagogy being negotiated or changed?
I'm sure you might just repeat the question again.
Of course, yeah. So linking back to previous points and your work here, can you say anything about the relationship between teacher agency and the likelihood of PE curriculum and pedagogy being negotiated or changed? So I think, if I'm interpreting this correctly, Laura, so it's something to do with teacher agency and whether or not teacher agency might have an impact on any future change in terms of curriculum or pedagogy.
Yeah, I don't think teacher agency will have any impact. Maybe again working that process of achieving agency. So what pedagogies are there that can facilitate the students that are in front of you to maybe move towards the achieving agency? I can't see teacher agency as a concept having any influence, but it's rather the context the teacher is in and how they're supported in the process of achieving agency through those different type of relationships, those interdependent relationships and the supports they receive. But I can't see the relationship between teacher agency and change. It's more the teacher I'd focus on. and how they operate within their different interdependent relationships in the process of achieving agency. I could have answered that incorrectly.
Well, Laura's apologising and she said, yes, it's her bedtime. So yes, that's what she meant. Yeah, so hopefully that you've responded to that well enough, but perhaps you two can have a chat about that at some other time as well. I'm sure that will be okay. But well done again. Good luck with PhD. I'm sure it will all be fine. And we'll now move on to our final presentation. So thanks again, Dylan. And the final presentation is entitled A Transformative Learning Journey of a Teacher Educator in Enacting an Activist Approach in Physical Education, Teacher Education. And the presenter today is Carla Lugetti, hopefully I've said that correctly, and she's from Victoria University in Australia, and her co-author is Kim Oliver from New Mexico State University. And in this presentation, the authors take us on a learning journey which highlights the struggles that PEAT educators face in their attempts to engage their students in critical pedagogies. So over to you now, Carla.
Hello, thank you so much. I want to say first, it's such a pleasure to be here and back in Bira. Bira was my first international academic conference. So I remember the great time I spent in Manchester, 2012. It was actually the first time I met Kim. So it's amazing to be back here. The inspiration for this article emerged from my experience in trying to apply an activist approach in a new country, in Australia. When I first started in academia, I had no thought about how an activist approach would become part of who I am as an educator. In my transformative learning journey, this way of work challenged my beliefs and the ways I see the world. So I decided to invite my mentor, the second author of this paper, Kim Oliver, to write this paper with me. So this paper presents moments which originated a change in my perspective, beliefs about young people, and an activist approach to teaching. Kim and I, and our reflexive process started 8 years ago during my PhD, and it has been nurtured since then in our weekly meetings. I employ critical autoethnography as the methodology to think deeply about my experiences based on my obligation to engage in critical praxis, what I believe is a principle to being an activist educator. We draw on an activist approach that's grounded in feminist theories and critical pedagogies. So utilizing a student-centered inquiry curriculum approach as a way of working with marginalized population. This approach emerged from 24 years of activist research with young people, where we collectively work with them to create programs that better meet their needs and interests. Next slide, please, if you could help me. I think it is stuck here. Thank you. So while advocacy for activist approach has grown over the years, there is little research that aims to understand transformative learning journeys PEAT educators facing when conceptualizing and practicing activist approach based on young people's voices. So through using the work of Paulo Freire and Black and Chicana feminists, this study explores a transformative learning journey I experience in enacting activist approach based on young people's voices. Next, please. As I mentioned, I have applied critical autoethnography as the methodology in order to have a critical examination of power, culture, and social processes in place. Next, please. So as a Brazilian PEAT educator, teaching health and physical education in a university located in Australia, I always consider myself as the other or someone who represents diversity. I remember my childhood and the economic difficulties we faced. So I grew up playing soccer and flying kites with friends who lived in favelas. Next, please. In the last 8 years, I've facilitated activist approaches in Brazil, the US, and Australia. My experiences with PEAT and activist approach began in 2015 with my postdoc with Kim Oliver. After that, I facilitated 2 studies, one in Brazil with a university community partnership and one in a PEAT unit in Australia. Next. For this specific paper, Kim and I organized 5 meetings, online meetings, where we discussed my learning trajectory in the following phases. So phase 1, my PhD, phase 2, my postdoc, phase 3, my experiences in apply and activist approach in Brazil, and the last phase, my experiences in apply an activist approach in Australia. Next. So starting to value young people's voices was a pivotal moment in my journey. I struggled to understand that I could not privilege one form of knowledge over any of the others. My background in teacher-centered approach was a barrier to valuing young people's voices. Kim could not tell me that young people's knowledge was important, but rather help me to see the value in young people's voices. It was after 11 sessions working with young people that I said to Kim, oh my God, Kim, the kids, they have the answer. Next, please. So in my postdoc with Kim, a pivotal moment emerged when I started to see gender inequities in my own pedagogical practices. Kim, an ecology instructor, helped me to see that the girls were not being included in my PEAT classes. I did not notice the gender dynamics. I think I could not see it because of my background as a high school girl in PE. I had to see Kim's data to believe. I had to leave someone documenting very specifically how I perpetuate these inequities before I could understand it. Next. So I went back to Brazil, motivated to implement an activist approach in my physical education program. So I invited young people from 2 schools close to the university to participate in this project. A pivotal moment in this project was when I started, or I wanted my student teachers to be where I was. I was impatient because they were not getting the activist approach in 6 months. I was asking the student teachers to teach something that they did not fully understand. So they saw me doing, but that was not enough for them to learn to do it by themselves. Next. So as soon as I arrived in Australia, I started to design a unit called Adolescent Health in a partnership with a secondary school. A pivotal moment in that study was my struggle to understand the complexities of teaching in a neoliberal context. My lack of understanding of neoliberal context led me to blame my students for not valuing my unit or myself. So I had to learn that my students expect the banking concept of education, and that these expectations were shaping their responses to this unit. Next, please. So in this study, it was clear how my positionality influenced the enactment of an activist approach, and also the role of a feminist mentor in the ongoing reflexive process. We believe that teachers' transformation happen in action with others, and teacher educators should engage in ongoing reflections and action with their students. our recommendation for future studies would be to explore PE educators' learning trajectories in enacting activist approach from diverse backgrounds and positionalities. In addition, we suggest that the role of a feminist mentor should be explored in future studies. For example, the mentor's learning trajectory in mentoring a slippery and provocative process. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carla. That was excellent. So interesting. We don't have any questions up at the moment, but I have a question for you, unsurprisingly. So you've obviously been doing lots of work in this area, and you've been researching your own journey. So where are you now, and how is the journey going? Is this something that you're still trying to achieve in your own context? How is it working? What are the challenges?
Yes, thank you for your question. Yeah, I think, you know, the process of being, it is always a process of being and becoming an activist educator. So I think I'm always learning. And in my learning trajectory now in Australia, I've been working with refugee background young people. And I think one thing that I've been learning a lot, it is the importance of having an activist approach and doing participatory action research, having co-participants as not just, you know, co-participants in something you as a researcher want to do. So I think we should involve it more, the co-participants, in the design of the whole research we are doing. So I think in my learning trajectory now, I've been exploring, and also in the units I'm teaching. So instead of just having, you know, co-participants as co-creating the units or curriculums, I think we should involve them to also co-design the research we are doing. And that's challenge, because it's this feeling of losing, you know, control, how uncomfortable it can be. But I think that's an important move to us in doing research. So how can we, in some ways, decolonizing this way and involving, you know, co-participants in the design, and let us go to, you know, results that we probably are not expecting to find.
Great, thanks. We have a question here now. It's from Jonathan McKeever again. Where do you see the place of an activist approach in spaces where no clear inequalities are present before you begin?
Oh, that's a good question. And if you think about intersections, you probably don't see social class. For example, I'm from Brazil, so we have a gap between poor and rich people. Social class, it is a huge issue. We have favelas and rich buildings sharing the same space. So perhaps you don't have favelas, but you have gender issues for sure. And we have a body of research that shows that in a PE context, for example, you have issues regarding race and ethnicity. So that's in place. So I always believe we always have social injustices in our HP, in our physical education, teacher education programs, and HP spaces. And that's, I think, connecting with, you know, Michael's presentation. My personal vision, it is, I have a social justice lens. So I always find, you know, social inequalities, and based on young people's voice, let's helping, you know, create spaces for them to name, critique, and transform those in social injustice. So I would say we always have social injustices in places.
Yeah, and you talked about having a critical lens, and I guess that's some of the things that you're trying to do that with your students. You're trying to get them to understand, what do we mean by a critical lens, and how do you use it? What are you looking for? Where are the inequalities that might not be that obvious, but they're there? I mean, can you maybe talk about some of the work you're doing with your current students along those lines?
Yeah, and the challenge piece, it is we cannot lecture them on that. like they have to live. So we have to design, you know, working with activist approach or any kind of critical pedagogy. We have to kind of modeling with them. So that's pretty much my work now in Australia with a unit called Adolescent Health. So we have a partnership with a school. And then in my class, I'm modeling with them, like by listening to my undergrad students' voices, I'm modeling with them what they could apply in the future with young people. So it's not just a matter of us reading, you know, Paulo Freire and other critical pedagogues, but it is about modeling in our, you know, own classes. And now teaching remotely has been challenged, but I've been also studying this remote teaching and the possibilities and impossibilities of, you know, keep applying or keep enacting critical pedagogy in those online spaces where we struggle to build relationships, and we have to find ways to interact with our students. But I think when we have, you know, the partnership with schools, what I can see it is the magical moment when my students' assumptions collide with what they are seeing in the reality. So when they are, for example, interviewing students, secondary school students, they start to see data that collides with their own assumptions, and that's when change happens, and that's challenge in a remote way of teaching. So I'm trying to dealing with that, but it's pretty much living the experience more than talking about that.
Great, thanks, and hopefully we'll be reading about some of that in the future. We think we could all learn a bit more about our online teaching, that's for sure. So thanks to everyone, thanks to the delegates for the questions, and thanks to the presenters. We're going to spend the next few minutes now opening this up again to everyone, and we'll invite all the speakers back to contribute to this discussion. And we do have some questions coming up just now, so I'll just turn to those, and then we'll see some of them have been directed at, are directly for our presenters today. So we'll perhaps go to those first, and then we'll open it up to some more general questions. So Kirsten, this first question is for you. Hi, Kirsten. Now, did we ask this one already? No. As there are many stakeholders, so government, head teachers, parents, etc., who have different perspectives on the terms you discussed, what approaches would you suggest for achieving joined up thinking, such as pupils' needs before the activity?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a challenge for us all the time, particularly when we're talking about policymakers, head teachers, whatever sectors. And all those people bring with them their own experiences of physical education, whether that's a 1960s experience or a more recent experience or somewhere internationally. And so part of that is shared conversation and dialogue through that. And I think I probably wouldn't go for negotiation, but prompting and challenging and critical inquiry around that together. So that we can come to some shared understandings. I don't think, like, we haven't made a huge amount of progress with our policymakers because, you know, you get new ministers and then it changes tomorrow. But if I guess that was part of our paper too, if we're not consistent around our messaging, then it's really hard to do that with the different parties that come in and out of the education space. So our first challenge is to come to shared understandings ourselves so that then we all talk, when we talk with those people on the same page. And for me, in my initial teacher education courses and in the work I do with teachers and principals in schools and community, we're just constantly using a line, planning for learning, not planning for doing. And it's just a constant rhetoric so that our teachers are held to account on that measure as well.
Thank you. So we don't have any other questions come in just now, so I'll just open up more of a general question for comment. So much of the research that you're all engaging with at the moment is about challenging something within the boundaries of physical education, or even changing something within the boundaries of physical education. But I quite like the idea that Mike spoke about, instead not challenging or changing, but negotiating, and that is, I suppose, somehow related to Dylan's work around working with partners and not trying to change but to collaborate. I mean, what does that mean? What does that mean for your work and your research? And is it useful to start thinking about the work that you're doing from this negotiating perspective rather than a change or challenging perspective? So I'll ask somebody to volunteer to begin the discussion there.
Well, I'll just throw something. I mean, from my perspective, I think life is about negotiating boundaries. And it depends how you want to go and define boundaries and what these are. Clearly, how you define negotiation is, I think, an interesting idea, where at one end that could be quite confrontational and on the other hand could be quite collaborative. But I think, just going back to Kirsten's response there, the challenge, so this would be my view, I think PE has got itself a place at the educational table in the 21st century in a way that it didn't have in the 20th century. I think that's really good. I think the issue now is, just as Kirsten was saying, how do you come to that table and negotiate with the people that make decisions that influence the route that we go down? And that will be about us being collaborative and working together and challenging each other and finding a way to negotiate with the punters out there who make those decisions. The long-term journey, but that's the 21st. I would put that out as the challenge. I'm old enough now to have had a vaccine, so it's not going to be me, but it's going to be a lot of you guys sitting there. So that's my starter for 10.
Sebastian, do you want to come in and contribute there?
Yeah, thanks. I totally agree that this is a challenge for us, but I wanted to look at the other end of educational processes, and I think that negotiation within the lessons is something we need to emphasize. So negotiating with, I think education or Bildung, if we take the idea of Bildung, is negotiating between individual needs and societal demands. So, and I think this is a negotiation process we need to do every day in every lesson. And this is what I find in the idea of Bildung. This is something to open up possibilities for another future. And this needs negotiation, I think, every day. So I really like this idea to emphasize this. But anyway, I do agree with Michael that on the other side, we also need to negotiate with decision makers about all this. And this is maybe it's the harder part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think from a personal perspective, where I've been quite lucky is I started off a chip on one shoulder and was quite, I suppose, assertive in my arguments in days gone by. I've now got a chip on two shoulders, and that sort of helps to be a little bit more balanced. And I think negotiation becomes a little bit easier when we feel less threatened. So I think there's a really emotional bit here where negotiation can become very uncomfortable if one party has a chip on their shoulder. And I am now coming up to almost 50 years student and teacher. And if I go back, Malcolm and I, back in those old days, it was pretty confrontational, because we didn't know how to move away out of only the physical domain. So I think a lot of the younger people coming through, there is a narrative there that enables physical education, building, whatever, to become part of the educational narrative of this century. And that, I think, enables negotiation to be a more positive experience and becomes part of the makeup of the individuals, as opposed to all of us being in our own corner and feeling threatened all the time. So I think it's a very emotional area, but it's a really important part of the future.
And I'll just, sorry, Dylan, I'll just add to that conversation we've had. Anne McPhail has made a comment there that, Dylan, you might respond to. Negotiating boundaries would be enhanced if we operated in more than one space, at more than one table, spanning the boundaries. I think that's a really good point.
Thanks, Shirley. And yeah, I come to a similar point to Anne's my second point to make, but I really like the word negotiation. I think we can, as Mike said, take different perspectives on it. For example, when I hear the word negotiation, I hear negotiation of different elements within a teaching situation. So think of a classroom, you have different elements. You have the teacher, human elements, students, you have non-human elements, the classroom, the environment, intangible elements, frustration, excitement, all different elements that negotiate the co-produce the situation. So just coming back to the study that I presented on, it shows how the teacher is only one element in this huge magnitude of different elements, all negotiation to co-produce the situation. And that's the perspective I was taking negotiation when I first heard the word in this conversation. But then to work off Anne's point as well, I agree that negotiation at the core of negotiation is dialogue. So we need to engage in dialogue, and engaging in dialogue means we talk to each other, we agree with each other, and more importantly, in my opinion, we disagree with each other. And I think in that disagreement, alongside agreement, is where the magic happens. That's where we can move forward. That's where the dialogue can move forward. So I think I'd agree with Anne. We need to work across the teacher education continuum, engage in dialogue, disagree, agree with each other, and that's where we can negotiate and move things forward.
Yeah. Carla, do you want to come in there?
Yes, I would love to. So I also love the word negotiation, and I was thinking about Michael's comments, how we have to define what negotiation means. I think I always use negotiation / transformation, because I believe we should also, see transformation as the end point. So what I'm saying is, like, negotiation for me, it is embedded in social justice. So although I understand that transformation can be hard, I believe that negotiation creates spaces to us to think about micro transformation in some sense. But I just want to share how I still see, transformation as our main purpose, and the hope embedded in thinking about the possibility of transformation.
Thank you, Carla. Does anybody else want to make a comment around that issue?
Can I just make one other comment and then I will shut up? I think we're talking about negotiating boundaries. I think it's really important that we acknowledge that different people are negotiating different boundaries. So it's really, really important to identify what the boundaries are. And if you take, so I'm looking at 5 or 6 people who presented the boundaries that you're negotiating in your roles as PhD student, as dean of whatever, these are different boundaries that people are negotiating in. So the arena, going back to Anne's point, the arena of physical education is full of people, A, who are negotiating different boundaries, and secondly, even if we're the same, working at the same job, we're actually looking at those boundaries differently. Some of them see boundaries as being a good thing. Some of them see things as something as hindering. So this concept of negotiating boundaries, there are 2 definitions. What do we mean by negotiation? But actually, how do we identify what the boundaries are? And that opens up a really interesting discussion at a micro level, but also at a macro level.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the advantages, not that there have been many, of the whole COVID situation is that we're doing a bit more of this online learning and this online communication and collaboration. And for me personally, that's opened up lots of different opportunities, as Anne talked about there, across different spaces with different people. And hopefully that's something that we can take forward once life gets back to normal. Malcolm, you have a question, I think, for Sebastian that perhaps
Yes, I do.
ask.
Thank you very much to all the contributors. There's some really useful comments there. I think I take Mike's point that we're really on the table and at the table now, and I think that's an important one. And I do think in a rather strange tangential way, the global pandemic has led to people talking about health, the importance of exercise to them and the wellness in heightened ways, which I think may actually have a dividend for the education of the body in schools in years to come. But I'm interested in this idea of speaking to Sebastian about the philosophical model which underpins Bildung, because it seems unusual that we are so close geographically, but yet there's another form of philosophy, continental, as opposed to our analytical philosophy, which informs curriculum planning. And so I was really thrilled about when Sebastian was talking about the movement moment of experience and the potential that has to link to a sense of embodiment and then to this idea of Bildung and self-cultivation. But my kind of macro negotiating question for Sebastian is the German model of having policy set at 16 state levels, how is that considered with regard to this area? Is that a relative strength or weakness, or is it a point of variability? Or how is that considered relative to what often happens in Anglophone countries, where you get a set of national curriculum parameters which everybody in some way has to adhere to?
Yeah, thanks, Malcolm, for your questions. These are more than two for me, but
yes,
I will try to make it quick. To go first on the philosophy on Bildung, maybe it's, I cannot go deep inside there, but it's more or less that we have moments when we see that what we do usually, that our system, how we interact with the world and ourselves, with body, with world, with experience, doesn't work, you know, and these moments make us rethink our system. So maybe this is a good explanation to give you the idea of Bildung. And then these moments are Bildung moments, you know, then I'm starting to rethink. And so just to give you an idea of what is beside or behind there. And your question on the system in Germany, it's a difficult question, because on the one side, I think it's a big strength that we have the federal system and the 16 different states, because it's not so easy to make a hard change in one direction. Maybe if we look at politics, populism and all this, so it's difficult to make a change in a direction, in a good direction or in a bad direction. So and I think this is something, could be something useful, but also is really hindering if we look at right now. And you know, I'm now working in Austria. This is even more complicated because it's another country. But I was working in last year in another state that I was living. So I had to deal with two different federal systems, educational systems. And if we look at the situation right now with the pandemic, for instance, we always have to deal with different rules changing every week. And so, so to be, it's not easy to act within this. I think it's a quite of, how can I say, change. It's not fast changing. It's impossible to make a fast change in there. And this is a strength, but it's also something hindering.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. Thank you.
I'm not sure if anybody would like to follow up on that. I mean, I do have a question that is related, and it's around this concept of Bildung. And I know if I relate it to our own curriculum here in Scotland, we have this health and well-being curriculum, and health is something that is holistic. It's both about the individual, but it's about the individual within society. But it's a responsibility of all. It's a whole school concept, really. And is Bildung the same, or is that something it's exclusive to the physical education curriculum?
No, not at all. Bildung is an idea which is behind everything, behind the whole school idea, if we take it like this. And so it's more the other way around, that in physical education, we try to adapt Bildung, and we try to figure out how Bildung works, because Bildung originally is more cognitive oriented, and it's difficult to figure out. I tried to give you an idea about experience, and if I experience something, then I can, it's something, it has to do with my own body, it has to do with movement, it has to do with perception of the world. And so it's more than just cognitive in my eyes. But this is something that comes out from the physical education discussion, and it's not originally Bildung. If you, it's Bildung in my eyes, but it's not what the in the original discussion about Bildung is what is discussed there.
Sure. And has it drawn from other theories or other writers around notions of, for example, embodiment and experiential learning?
Sorry, I didn't get your question. Can you repeat
it? It sounds to me like perhaps you've drawn from other theories or concepts around, for example, experiential learning or embodiment, which is perhaps the point that Malcolm was making.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Not so much about embodiment, but more about experiential learning. Yeah.
Okay, does anybody else have any comments or questions for the audience, for the presenters? We don't have any questions coming in now from delegates.
Could I ask a question?
Of course.
Yes. Could I ask Dylan about the LCPE curriculum has 128 learning outcomes? How is that possible? And does that impinge upon Brendan as he tries to make his progress through the 2-year course?
Thanks, Malcolm. Yeah, I agree with your question. Is it possible? I suppose what the professional development services here in Ireland are advocating for is a non-linear approach to teaching and learning. So creating a learning experience on one learning outcome and be able to hang different learning outcomes on it. So you're teaching a number of learning outcomes through one learning experience. And that's the approach that the professional development are pushing. We did a study on this as well. We followed a couple of teachers over 2 years and how they taught through a non-linear pedagogy, because they're educated and their teaching background is in a linear pedagogy, where they're used to teaching in a very linear, start with learning outcome number 1 and work your way down. So this whole notion of a non-linear is very new to teachers here. So obviously that brought up a lot of challenges. And yes, it definitely did constrain Brendan's teaching and his process of achieving agency for obvious reasons, not being used to a non-linear pedagogical approach, trying to understand the learning outcomes. This is the first time examinable physical education was done in Ireland. That brings its own challenges as well. So again, comes back to all the different elements that were in Brendan's situation and how they negotiated to co-produce the situation that he found himself in. But the non-linear pedagogy is the approach that the professional development providers are advocating for.
Yeah. Could you conceive of a way, Dylan, that the spirit of non-linear pedagogy, which I get, could be ordered in such a way that it didn't become this hugely systematic, outcome cluttered arrangements? Would there be a way of it keeping the spirit of the learning and teaching in a way that dovetailed with a plausible assessment?
I think it's difficult because of the context the subject is in. It's in a leaving certificate context, very high stakes environment. This is the highest level of highest examinations students do in post-primary students. It's very, very summative assessment. The teachers don't assess their own students. It's all external. So the context is in very much constrains the potentialities of the non-linear pedagogy, or as you said, the teaching and learning philosophy that underpins that. The high stakes accountable leaving certificate tag constrains that.
Yes. So that's a very similar encounter that Sebastian was reporting, that the subjectiveness that is associated positively with Bildung might get slightly restricted by the outcomes measurements and everything. So in a way, that's a familiar concern, you know, how you can, but it's an interesting one.
It almost sounds like opposites. non-linear and specific learning outcomes.
Yes.
So there's a sort of, it doesn't sort of really marry itself. And speaking from somebody who spends his whole life at Edinburgh University going, why do we keep talking about learning outcomes? Because they become ultimately very, very specific and very constraining. So if you're talking about non-linear with specific learning outcomes, it is good you've got 180, but still it's, it's a really interesting topic.
I'm just conscious of time now. It's 5:02, and I think we're to round things up here. So Marie, you can tell me if I'm wrong in that, but I'd just like to thank, first of all, the people who came along to listen to these presentations today and for asking some really interesting, insightful questions. Thanks to the presenters for your really brilliant presentations today, really thought-provoking, and some excellent discussion that we've had at the end here. I'd also like to thank those authors who contributed to the special issue who weren't able to present today. But I do know that the special issue is now out, so if anyone's interested in reading more about those papers, then yeah, that's available now. I'd like to thank Bera for helping to organise this session today, as well as the Curriculum Journal. And Mark, excuse me, I've got a small child shouting outside. I have to shut my door. I'd like to, yeah, thank Bera for helping to organise today, and also the Curriculum Journal. I think I said that. Mark Priestley was very, very helpful throughout the whole process. Malcolm and I fired lots and lots of questions to him throughout the process. But finally, I'd like to thank Malcolm Thorburn, who I've worked with on this this journey, this project. It's been a real pleasure, and I've learned lots and lots from doing it. So, Malcolm, I don't know if you want to say anything just whilst we finish, before we finish.
Well, I would just like to endorse everything you say, and thanks to all that have been involved. And I'd like to wish those who are viewing this from the Northern Hemisphere have a very productive day. And for those in the Southern Hemisphere, sweet dreams.
Thanks, everybody.